And let me just get this ready. All right, cool. So, okay, so hi everyone. This is the Trauma in the Brain training. It's how traumatic and stressful events can impact the brain. My name is Erin Wiesenthal. I'm a licensed master social worker, and I've been with Family Services at the Center for Victim Safety and Support for almost 3 years as a trauma therapist. So I like to start this training off by just going over some definitions of trauma. Trauma is a direct experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury, or other threat to one's physical integrity, or witnessing an event that involves death, injury, or threat to a physical integrity of another person. It's also learning about unexpected or violent death, serious harm, or threat of death or injury by a family member or someone close to you. I like to use this quote. Using this framework can be understood that exposure to trauma can have neurological long and short-term effects on feeling, thinking, behavior, relationships, and self-perception. Trauma challenges the need of people for the world to be predictable, just, orderly, and controllable so that they can anticipate the sequence of events in their life, know what will most probably happen at certain times, and plan with some safety. Some more definitions of trauma include complex trauma, which is very important to know in our work with victims. It's extended exposure to multiple simultaneous, sequential, or prolonged traumatic events, most often in the context of interpersonal relationships or family trauma, such as intimate partner violence. This can place a person at risk for severe physical health and mental health problems. Retraumatization is the reemergence of symptoms previously experienced as a result of trauma. A victim meets a reaction of disbelief, minimization, and pressure to keep it a secret. This can be very re-traumatizing, and we see it very often. Some examples are a child who is sexually abused by her cousin is forced to keep it a secret. A child who discloses a traumatic experience to her mother is met with a response of, "Your cousin would never do that to you." Or a woman who shared her traumatic narrative to a friend is met with a response of, "So that's all he did to you?" Secondary traumatization or vicarious trauma is indirect impact of trauma exposure on those who experience it secondhand via intensive personal or professional relationships with primary victims. Some closely related concepts include compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress, vicarious effects, empathic strain, and co-victimization. Some examples of those who suffer from secondary traumatization are immediate family members of those who have suffered trauma. At CVSS, we often work with secondary victims as well as primary victims. Close family members, co-workers, and/or friends of victims of trauma. And also important to know are advocates, therapists, supervisors, teachers, law enforcement officers, lawyers, or anyone who may come in contact or repeated contact with somebody who has experienced trauma. Some group aspects of trauma, which are very closely related, but some have some specific distinctions, are important to know also. Cultural trauma is a traumatic event that is intended to harm a particular group perpetrated by an external source. An example would be the execution of particular groups, colonization and destruction of indigenous nations. Collective or mass trauma is experienced by a large number of people and can be an isolated or ongoing event. Example would be exposure to wars, widespread exposure to political or economical or physical changes in a community that conflicts with morals and values. And community disaster is traumatic, collectively experienced event that is man-made or natural. This can also include ongoing war and chronic political violence. Why is it important to know these terms? To provide judgment-free services to our clients, to be aware of how trauma affects individuals, family systems, and communities, to be aware of how our work with victims and families of victims can impact us, and to understand that trauma-informed care is crucial in this work. It's important to know where someone is coming from, so it's important to meet a client where they're at in that moment. I also like to go over some I just looked at the messages. Are people still getting an echo? No. Okay. Okay.
No.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's important too to go over some important brain regions and their functions in understanding the context of trauma in the brain. So it's a lot of them are interconnected. A lot of them have similar functions, but it's important to talk about when understanding how trauma impacts the brain. So we're going to go over some major parts. The cerebrum, it interprets touch, vision, sound, speech, reasoning, emotions, learning, and fine motor control. The cerebellum is responsible for balance, movement, and posture. The brainstem is a relay center that contacts the cerebrum and cerebellum to the spinal cord and performs automatic functions such as heart rate, body temperature, breathing, digestion, and etc. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functioning. Executive functioning is decision making, moderation of social behaviors, problem solving, planning with long and short term goals in mind, and can help differentiate between conflicting thoughts. The frontal lobe is responsible for personality, behavior, speech, movement, self awareness, intelligence, concentration, judgment, planning, and problem solving. The thalamus is responsible for relaying most incoming sensory information to the brain, so sight, sound, touch, and taste, and plays a role in attention, alertness, and memory. The basal ganglia works with the cerebellum to coordinate fine motor movements, and the limbic system is responsible for emotional expression, memory, motivation, and meaning making. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system and maintains homeostasis. The amygdala processes fear, identifies threats, assists in fight or flight response, and assists in emotional memory storage. And the hippocampus is involved in short and long-term memory storage. So there's a little image at the bottom. The thinking brain, the emotional brain, and the instinctive brain. So the thinking brain would be the parts of the brain that we discussed in the beginning of the brain regions and functions. And the emotional brain is like the limbic system, which is the mammalian brain, and the instinctive brain is the reptilian brain. So here is another image that I really like that breaks it down, simplifies it. The neocortex, cerebrum, or the human brain, also the prefrontal cortex, the limbic or mammalian brain, and the reptilian primitive brain. So brain processes during stressful or traumatic events. A signal is sent to the hypothalamus, which communicates with the rest of the body. Epinephrine or adrenaline is pumped into the bloodstream after the sympathetic nervous system sends signals to the adrenal glands, providing the body with a burst of energy to respond to danger or perceived danger. This causes increased heart rate, blood pressure, more rapid breathing, and heightened alertness due to increased oxygen in the brain. It prepares the body to respond, so it triggers the fight, flight, freeze, or faint response. And then the amygdala interprets the threat. The process happens rapidly, even before the cerebral cortex or the human brain has a chance to understand the danger or perceived danger. The parasympathetic nervous system assists in calming the body down after a stressful or traumatic event occurs. If dysregulated, this can create long-term health issues. Often with those who have suffered trauma, the human part of the brain does not immediately know the difference between real or perceived threat. So moving on to brain development, early maltreatment can contribute to developmental failures in brain regions such as limbic system and prefrontal cortex in early childhood. This can cause disruption of chemicals that function as neurotransmitters, and maltreatment and trauma can cause elevated levels of cortisol and decreased levels of oxytocin, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This can negatively affect growth and development of neural pathways, which help send signals from brain to body and are critically involved with the memory process. Just a quick video I'd like to show before moving on. it is.
Classrooms, it's been useful in corporate offices, it's been useful for mediation, for meditation, for people out in the field working with the stresses of working with epidemics, and for people who are just in general trying to improve their lives. So let's go through this hand model and see how it can support your work and your life. If you take your hand and put your thumb in the middle and fold your fingers over the top, this would be the completed model. The top of the brain is called the cortex and would be represented in your fingers. If you lift up the cortex, you'll see beneath it the limbic area, which should have two thumbs to be a perfect model, but most of us just have one. And in this limbic area, you see that there are connections upwards to the cortex and even downwards to the area just below it called the brain stem in your palm. And this whole head brain is connected to the body through a number of regions, including the spinal cord represented in your wrist. Now let's quickly review what these areas do, and you can see how what you do with your mind can change the way the brain functions. If we lift up the cortex and lift up the limbic area, let's begin with the brainstem. The brainstem is the oldest part of this head brain, and I keep on saying head brain because you have neurons around your heart and around your intestines that people are calling the gut brain and the heart brain. And so I'll use the word just brain, but actually it's a hand model of the head brain. The deepest, oldest part of the head brain is this brainstem. It takes in information from the body and it helps regulate things like how you breathe and how you digest food, how your heart functions. In addition, the brainstem has a very important set of regions that create the fight, flight, freeze, and faint response that comes when we feel threatened. So if you're working in a business, for example, or you're in a classroom or you're at home and you feel threatened by what's going on, the brainstem gets involved to create this reactive state. In addition, this brainstem works closely with, if you put your next area down, the thumb region, which is the limbic area. This is a 200 million year old region when we became mammals that works with the 300 million year old reptilian brain. And together they work to create emotion in working with the body. The body, brainstem, limbic area create emotion. The brainstem works with the limbic area to also motivate us to drive our behaviors. And this limbic area appraises the meaning of things, whether things are significant or not, whether they're good or bad. In addition, there are certain ways memory is divided up and connected through the limbic area with an area you may have heard, the hippocampus, or with its amygdala region. And then on top of that, you have the attachment experience we have as mammals, where we connect with caregivers so that they can protect us and we can be soothed by them, is also mediated by this limbic region, not just in childhood, but throughout our whole lifespan. Now, these limbic functions work closely if you fold your fingers over with the cortex, which is basically making maps. So this region makes maps of the outside world with our eyes in the back, the occipital cortex. Sound comes in the side, the temporal lobe, with the way in which we map out sound. And you even have an area in the front from these second to last knuckles forward called the frontal cortex, also known as the association cortex, where you make associations in thought. And the frontmost part of this frontal lobe here is demarcated by your last knuckles down to your fingernails, and this is called the prefrontal cortex. Now, you may have heard a lot about the prefrontal cortex because it's involved basically in something called integration. It integrates cortex, limbic area, you can see it sits on top of it, brainstem, body, and even the social world together. Now, when you do a practice, let's say like we have a wheel of awareness practice as a form of mindfulness meditation, or do any kind of mindfulness reflective practice, you are integrating the whole system. When you're not integrated, it can become chaotic and rigid. It's like flipping your lid. So instead of living with harmony within yourself and harmony and connection to others, you're literally becoming chaotic with an outburst or rigid and withdrawn. That's demonstrated by literally lifting up your fingers and showing how this prefrontal region is no longer linking the cortex, limbic area, brainstem, body, and the social world. It's become disintegrated. Now, the
Okay, so I love that video. It's something that's very useful when explaining trauma reactions and trauma in the brain to parents, teens, and even children. There's a couple fun little exercises that I like to do with kids, to help them kind of understand and help them cope. It simplifies the brain functions and the fight, flight, freeze, faint responses. And I also wrote there fidget and fool around responses, because oftentimes when working with children and, in the context of school, you see kids who are fidgeting a lot. Maybe they can't sit still. Maybe they're playing with something constantly, or you have that class clown who acts out and tries to get attention from others. Those are also stress responses. It's fight, flight, freeze, faint, fidget, and fool around responses in children. So imagine this happening all the time as a child. What could be some long-term implications of this? And if you want to answer in the text box, feel free. I'll just give a couple minutes or a couple seconds for anyone who wants to respond. What could be the long-term implications for prolonged traumatic exposure with children? Mm-hmm. Depression, yep, definitely. Can't focus, yep. Anxiety, yep, absolutely. Labeling as a problem child, that's a big one. Poor self-control, so impulsivity, yeah, it can make school very, very difficult. I'm going to keep referring back to working with children just because I work with a lot of kids. And it's kind of where it starts, when kids spend so much of their time in school. So those are really great points. I'm going to just move on. So that's the hand brain model. Dan Siegel is he's an amazing psychiatrist. He's an expert in trauma in the brain. So brain development continued. Cortisol. Cortisol is released by the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal gland, also known as the HPA axis, when the body is actively engaged in the stress response. It provides the body with glucose by tapping into the protein sources in the liver, which then provides the body with energy. This can alter the immune system response. It suppresses digestive system, reproductive system, and growth processes, which are not needed for immediate survival. Long-term implications of increased cortisol levels are anxiety, depression, GI and digestive issues, heart disease, chronic headaches and/or migraines, sleep issues, memory and concentration issues, and other physical health concerns. So back to that hand-brain model, and some of you said that it can impact impulsivity, problem child, depression, anxiety. That's a big one, that memory and concentration issues. It's also important to know that the body continues to release cortisol even after a stressful event. So something stressful can happen and then it's quiet for a while, but cortisol is still being released. So imagine if something stressful happens, it's quiet, and then something stressful happens again, and it's kind of constant throughout the day or constant throughout someone's life. Brain development, oxytocin. In the chat box, does anybody want to say or take a guess at what some nicknames of this hormone are? Love hormone, feel good hormone. Yep. Relaxation hormone. Yep. Some others are love drug, which is not a drug, but some people call it that anyway. Hug hormone or cuddle chemical, which is my favorite. So when the body is engaged in the stress response, the release of this neuropeptide decreases. And oxytocin generally impacts trust, attachment, social bonding, intimacy, and management of stress. In women, oxytocin impacts experiences during labor, contractions or experiences during pregnancy, contractions when in labor, lactation when nursing, mother-infant bonding, and maternal instincts. In men, oxytocin impacts movement of sperm, then testosterone reproduction. It's also been recently identified as having a positive impact on chronic pain and injury healing. So if you can imagine a newborn child whose mother is being abused by the father, that's a constant stressor for the mother. The mother's focused on survival. So attachment is not optimal. So the child is not necessarily getting what they need for that secure attachment. And then there can be these long-term implications for that. So oxytocin is very important and something that's being heavily researched. So neurotransmitters. I'm just going to read through these quickly because I do think that they're really important to know. Acetylcholine activates muscles and central nervous system and is involved in involuntary movement, learning, memory, and sleep. Too much of this can be associated with depression, and too little has been associated with dementia. Dopamine is involved with movement, attention, and learning and pleasure centers. Too much has been associated with schizophrenia, and too little with some depression, muscular rigidity, and some symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Gamma aminobutyric acid inhibits excitation and anxiety. So too little is often associated with anxiety and anxiety disorders. Endorphins is involved with pain relief and feelings of pleasure. So too few can be associated with depression and anxiety. Epinephrine is involved with energy, glucose levels, and metabolism. So too little can be associated with depression. Serotonin involves mood, sleep, appetite, impulse control, and aggressive behavior. So too little can be associated with depression and some anxiety disorders. Important to note, during traumatic or stressful events, the brain is not processing info the way that it does when engaging in normal or typical activities. The brain enters survival mode, and everyone has a different response to traumatic events, going back to that fight, flight, freeze, faint, fidget, fool around response. You might have one kid who excels in school and doesn't behave that way, and you might have a class clown or somebody who can't sit still. Most manage trauma in time, while many have temporary processing issues, and some processing issues can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And before we move on, I would like to show this other video, which I love. Okay.
Hey, welcome back. Today, I really wanted to think about what's the best way to teach teachers about trauma without getting them distracted with all the technical stuff, and what's the most important thing for them to understand and learn. And I thought that the best way to do it might be to just make a difference between a learning brain versus a brain in survival mode. So we'll just call it learning brain versus survival brain. And this is the difference. So learning brain is this brain that's open to learning new information, and it's completely okay with ambiguity and grays and vagueness, and it sees the big picture. It like pulls back and is on the balcony, can look over the forest and figure out what's going on. On an emotional level, people in learning brain feel calm, peaceful, maybe a little excited about what they're about to learn, maybe a little playful and having fun too, and definitely curious. And they're not afraid of making mistakes because it's just part of the learning process. And so they're not really thinking about themselves. And they actually feel a little bit of confidence that if they just apply themselves, they might pick up what they're trying to learn. Now, survival brain, on the other hand, is completely different. It's hyper-focused on threat. It doesn't like ambiguity. It wants clear, hard facts. It thinks in black and white terms. It doesn't want anything to be gray at all. And then emotionally, you can imagine that survival brain makes people feel panicky, feel like a little obsessive and afraid of getting things wrong. And they don't feel calm and open to learning new things. They just want to get things over with. And people in survival brain also really don't like making mistakes, and they are afraid of looking stupid too. So students in survival brain don't want to be picked on. They don't want to raise their hand and ask questions and look stupid. And so these people are also filled with doubt about their own ability to learn stuff, and they're afraid that other people can see how stupid they really are. Now, it's really important to understand how learning brain and survival brain interact, because survival brain always trumps learning brain. And it makes sense because survival brain is just trying to save your life. And so if it thinks that there's something dangerous happening, you better pay attention to it, right? But the tricky thing is that as survival brain stays on longer and longer, it's harder to get out of that. And it's harder to really go into learning brain. And the way I think about it is kind of like the myth of Sisyphus. You know, that guy who has to push a rock up a hill, and then every day it falls back down and he has to do it over and over again. Well, being in learning brain is like being up on the high parts of that mountain. You can see the expanse of what's going on, but it also takes a lot of work to be up there. And at any second, if you're not paying attention and putting effort into it, it's so easy to slip back into survival brain again. And that rock that Sisyphus is trying to push up, well, that's kind of like stress. And the more stressed you feel, the heavier and bigger that rock gets, and it just pushes you back into survival brain quicker. Now, the kicker is that for traumatized people, stress is a really rigid and intense thing. And so with trauma, any little stress makes that rock grow way bigger than it normally would. And because people with trauma misperceive ambiguous situations as threatening and stressful, that rock just stays big all the time. Now, the good news is that the more you control stress, well, the easier it is to be in learning brain, right? Because that rock is a lot smaller. And what I really want to highlight for teachers is that the best way to keep students in learning brain goes back to why I spent so much time talking about attachment. Students best learn when they feel like they're safe and supported by the adults around them. So it's kind of like a baby elephant. You know how like on those nature shows, the baby elephant is like playing with leaves or exploring a tree or something like that and having a lot of fun. And the only reason why they can do that is because there's a whole group of mama elephants around that baby protecting it and looking out for danger. So a kid with trauma or who's stuck in survival brain, it's kind of like that baby elephant who doesn't have protective adults around them. They can't play and learn because they're way too focused looking out for threat and danger. This is why I really believe that the most important thing that schools need to focus on, way more important than any kind of techniques or curricula, is really whether or not they are creating that environment where students feel like they're surrounded by these big mama elephants who are going to protect them and watch out for them and make them safe. And when students have that, I bet you it unlocks their curiosity, their eagerness to learn and play as a way to learn. So I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks.
Okay, so I really like that video because it's, the context is school, but I think that it can work when working with children who have been victims of crime, but also teens and adults, because it can kind of inform how their reactions sometimes are, like we might think that they're overreacting to something, but really it's a perceived threat or danger to them. So I know there's an adverse childhood experience training, but I think it's really tough to talk about trauma in the brain without just going over ACEs a little bit. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences that harm children's developing brains and lead to changing how they respond to stress and damaging their immune systems so profoundly that the effects show up decades later. ACEs cause much of our burden of chronic disease, most mental illness, and are at the root of most violence. So ACEs was a study that addressed the implications of childhood abuse and neglect and other traumas throughout the lifespan. There were 17,000 participants who studied over the course of 25 years. And the categories, these are the very broad categories. It also breaks it down into other subcategories, but they were abuse, household challenges, and neglect within the first 18 years of a child's life. I'm not sure if you can see, because this picture is pretty blurry for some reason, but adverse childhood experiences affect traumatic brain injury and fractures and burns. There's a higher correlation. Depression, anxiety, suicide, PTSD, unintended pregnancy, pregnancy complications, and fetal death, HIV and STDs, chronic disease, risky behaviors such as alcohol, drug abuse, and unsafe sex, and decreased opportunities such as education, occupation, and income. So I mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes people, depending on resilience and risk factors, bounce back quickly after a traumatic experience. But sometimes when there's a processing issue, they can develop PTSD or symptoms of PTSD. So individuals with PTSD will experience the following for at least 1 month: re-experiencing symptoms such as flashbacks or nightmares. Avoidance often of people, places, and thoughts. So we often see some people will take a different route home so they don't pass the area where they were assaulted. Hyperarousal or hypervigilance. I would say for example, in young children, the hyperarousal can look just like super, super high energy. And hypervigilance, somebody who doesn't understand what's going on, can look like paranoia. But when we work with people who suffer from symptoms of PTSD, we know that hypervigilance is coming from a place of fear. It also affects mood symptoms such as anger and depression, and they have negative beliefs and feelings. They also experience feelings of hopelessness, shame, and despair, sometimes, not all the time, substance abuse or misuse, relationship and family issues, employment problems, sleep disturbances, and changes in appetite. So at CVSS, we work with victims of crime. It's a short-term program, so it's very solution-focused. Oftentimes we assess for symptoms of PTSD, and then we kind of work on how to help them through those symptoms of PTSD and develop some strengths. Usually they have lots of strengths and they just aren't aware. One of the things that comes up a lot are flashbacks. And a flashback is when an individual re-experiences their trauma or elements of their trauma. So they may feel physiologically like they're in that moment again. Some of the work with victims of abuse involves practicing grounding and mindfulness techniques they can utilize when experiencing a flashback. It's important to work towards identifying triggers also. Sometimes they know what their trigger is and sometimes they don't. So kind of sometimes a step-by-step discussion about, well, I had this flashback, and then going back a few moments and talking about the trauma, and oh, well, this happened, maybe that's why you had a flashback. And then dissociation. It occurs when there is a severed connection between a person's thoughts, feelings, memories, actions, and the present moment. The experience of an automatic response while not paying attention to immediate environment. A good example of this would be like a daily example, not traumatic example, but something that most of us have experienced would be being on autopilot. You get in your car at the end of a really long day of work, and all of a sudden you're home and you're like, how did I get here? I don't remember that. That's an example, a minor example of dissociation. So in this state, the cerebrum is shut down and is unable to notice the immediate environment. Victims often dissociate during an assault as a means of protection. Grounding and mindfulness techniques, which help individuals engage the senses, can help them focus on the present. I think someone's not on mute. There's a tiny bit of feedback. So, did I skip something? No, okay. So some grounding techniques. I do grounding techniques a lot with kids, but often with adults also. The idea is to engage the senses because, like I mentioned in the previous slide, you're not in the present moment. You're in your trauma a little bit, or you're disengaged from your body to protect yourself. So sometimes I have clients who really want a concrete thing. So I give them a list, and there's all these grounding techniques on it. And the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise is pretty popular with people who want a concrete exercise they can use. And basically, does anybody know what the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise is? If they want to type it in the chat box, they're more than welcome. You don't have to type the whole thing. It can be kind of long if you want to just throw in some elements of it. Yeah. Yes. Find something you can touch, see, smell, hear. Ice cube in the mouth. That is a grounding exercise, and that could be used in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So You're all right. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is you find 5 things you can see, 4 things you can feel, like physically you can touch. Yep. 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and then 1, it depends on what you like. I like to do 1 positive affirmation. If I have a good relationship with the client, the client knows that they're safe with me. Sometimes I have a client who has a cup of coffee with them, and I'll do 1 thing you can taste, and they'll take a sip of their coffee. And then the shapes exercise is another one too. I really like doing that because it encourages the client to get really creative and really take in their surroundings. So I'll ask something like, look around the room and find 4 things that are shaped like a square. And oftentimes I met with this, oh, that's ridiculous. Why are you making me do that? But it really gets them integrated into their environment. And then I'll do 3 things that are shaped like a triangle and 2 things that are a really funky shape. And that gets people really, really grounded and in the moment. Somebody mentioned ice cube in the mouth. So I would say that could work as long as it doesn't hurt you. Or take a drink of water or splash some water in your face. Splash some water on your face is something I've used with some kids who maybe they have a free pass to go to the bathroom when they're anxious, or 504 allows them to take a walk if they need to. Those kids, sometimes I'll encourage them to go to the water fountain or the bathroom and just splash some water on their face. Other kids who can't really do that, I'll encourage them to carry water with them, take a drink of water. Putting an ice in that would also be really helpful because of that cold sensation. And then read out loud something that's not stress inducing. I always say, please don't read the news, because reading is very grounding. So another thing too is making eye contact with a safe person if that person is comfortable making eye contact with others. These are also things too, and actually let me go to the next slide and then I'll say that. Oh, yay. So I have to talk about Bosch because I work with him so much and he's the best co-therapist ever. I work with Bosch often, and he helps some of my clients who are children testify. So when we're working on the relationship with Bosch, I use him as a grounding. Bosch has a lot of fans. I use him as a grounding exercise all the time because, for example, I'll say, Bosch is what color? And the kid will say, he's a golden retriever, so he's golden or he's yellow. And then we kind of look like, what's the difference in the color of his paws and the color of his back? How does the hair feel on the top of his head versus his back? What does he look like? Is he warm? Is he fluffy? Does he have really stinky breath? Is he really heavy when he jumps up on your lap? And that gets them really, like, the idea is that he's on their lap while they're testifying, for example, to help ground them. So they're really able to focus on him in the moment when they have to talk about their trauma. Oops. Yes, sometimes stinky breath. That is very true. And then mindfulness, very similar to grounding. So some of those things that can be considered mindfulness techniques, but mindfulness is associated with the prefrontal cortex, the activation of the prefrontal cortex. So if you remember back to the Dan Siegel video with the hand model, he talked about when you're flipping your lid, your prefrontal cortex is not integrated with the rest of your brain and your body and your social environment. So doing a mindfulness technique like deep breathing, meditation, body scanning, body awareness, or yoga can help strengthen that prefrontal cortex with the rest of your body and your mind. So going back to trauma in the brain a little bit more, long-term mental health concerns are often those who have suffered traumatic events are resilient, meaning their ability to bounce back allows them to process and grow from their experiences. Many, especially those who have suffered complex trauma, struggle with mental health issues, and some mental illnesses have been associated with traumatic experiences, especially during childhood. At CVSS, we don't diagnose. We work with people and we try to address the symptoms of PTSD, and we really look at the environment and what's gone on in their life. So it's important to identify what happened to the client and not what is wrong with them. It's important to identify strengths, resources, and protective factors when working with trauma survivors also, especially in that short-term capacity, because then, you want to kind of finish your therapy with them. They have an idea of like, who are my supports, and wow, I got through that on my own, and who can I lean on if I need to, and wow, I actually am way stronger than I thought. And resilience. Resilience is a person's ability to bounce back from an adverse childhood experience or circumstance in a quick and effective manner. Post-traumatic growth, which is a term I love, refers to positive changes that some gain following a traumatic event, including the strengthening of individuals, family systems, and communities. A lot of work with individuals in this setting involves people identifying their own strengths and recognize resilience. Some important takeaways, just wrapping up a little bit, although I do want to go back to one thing I forgot. Everyone is affected by trauma differently. So an example of that would be two siblings abused by the same relative may handle and process their traumatic experiences in much different ways. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but the idea is that you have a family and there's two kids who have experienced the same trauma. One student maintains an A average and is an all-star sport and has great social relationships, and they internalize their suffering. And then the other child might not do so well in school and might not have great friends and acts out as the class clown or the one who fidgets all the time. It's just, sometimes there's nature versus nurture, and people handle things much differently. When an individual experiences a traumatic event, the brain enters survival mode, meaning regular thought processes do not function properly as the reptilian brain is attempting to protect you. And those who suffer from PTSD or symptoms of PTSD often experience flashbacks, nightmares, and dissociation as their alarm system in their brain perceives a threat to be real. So that said, trauma-informed care is crucial in order to offer a judgment-free, safe space for victims of trauma to connect and heal. I forgot to mention I wanted to talk about grounding and mindfulness a little bit more too. It's really important to encourage clients and yourself even to kind of like practice these things, because in session all the time we'll talk about, this is the grounding exercise that worked really well for you. And so the thinking is the next time I'm triggered, I'm going to do the shapes exercise. But what really happens is that brain enters in survival mode, and the way that they've reacted to protect themselves for however long is what ends up happening. You forget that you really want to do that shapes exercise. So what can happen is this idea of rewiring or retraining the brain, of practicing that shapes exercise multiple times a day. Sometimes I encourage clients to set a timer on their phone, every hour or whatever works for them, do a quick meditation exercise, or if you can do yoga once or twice a day, try to do something like that. And that kind of rewires the brain so that when you get into that situation where you're triggered, you can your brain is rewired or retrained to use that exercise to help minimize that stress response. Okay, so that's it for trauma in the brain, and I would love if anyone has any questions or comments, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat box. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you like the picture of Bosch. Is there a way to tell if someone is resilient or just blocking the trauma? That's a great question. I think that sometimes that comes out in therapy, because like someone who's not working closely with that client might look at that person and think, wow, how stoic, they just let it roll off their shoulder. I see that all the time with kids. They're, I don't know why I'm here. Everything's fine. But then once you start to get to know them a little bit, you can see a little bit of how the trauma is really affecting them. And I do think that people block trauma a lot. It's a way that they can survive. It's a way they can keep moving forward, but not working through it and not using coping skills, just ignoring it comes out later in life or not even that long after it's happened and can be really disruptive. That's a great question. I hope that answered your question. You're welcome, Beckett. Any more questions? Or Kathy, did I answer your question? Thanks. Okay. No problem. Okay. I think we're done.